today what we're going to be talking about is Stretto. What is it? When do we do it? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? So we're going to be going through a bunch of Fiore quotes and looking at some art and kind of exploring this aspect of fencing. So, the first question is, what is Stretto? And to answer that question, as we answer all of these questions, we will go directly to Fiore's text. So, at the beginning of the narrow section, we can see some quotes describing what that section contains. We can see here, we begin the narrow play of the two-handed sword, in which you will see all manner of covers, strikes, locks, dislocations, sword disarms, and throws to the ground. There will also be the remedies and the counters needed for each situation, whether you are attacking or defending. Similar quote right here begins the play of the sword in two hands, the narrow play, the method of breaking all thrusts and cuts, in which will be every method of covering, striking, and binding, and dislocations, and grapples, and takings of the swords, and beating to the ground in diverse ways, and there will be remedies and counters of every category that should offend or defend. So kind of saying the same thing, slightly different vocabulary. But this is the first and easiest of the questions we have for Fiore. What is Stretto? Stretto is covering, striking, locking, binding, dislocations, grapples, throws, disarms, and counters to all of those things. Cool, great, end of presentation, we're done, right? So you can see here are some of the examples of those plays, and we're going to talk about more about them, why we do them, what's important, and eventually how to do some of them. So we've answered what is Stretto. So our next question is, when should we use it? Right? This is an important aspect of the art. As Sean has talked about before, techniques must be done in the right tempo and measure. So what is the correct tempo and measure to execute Stretto? So again, we will go straight to Fiore's text and ask him, when should we be doing this? This image is from the beginning of the Stretto section. He says, because of the way that we stand here crossed, the play is given to whoever knows more and is swifter. But since many plays are made from such a crossing, we will only be making the strongest counters. If we look at this is the Stretto crossing quote. If we look at the Reverso crossing quote, he says, this is the cover of the backhand for making plays of the greatest deceptiveness. So not a lot of information here, right? Previously, we just read his quote and it answered our question. Here we're getting a little bit of information. We know that he says, because of the way we stand here crossed, right? This is Fiore's attempt to explain measure. We don't yet have a fully codified description of measure based on, his writings. It starts to develop soon after this, but this is his explanation. We know that the crossings determine the distance between you and your opponent. So he says, because of the way we stand here crossed, right? We can look at where our art shows us having them be crossed. We know this is the Stretto crossing. We can see that they're kind of crossed at the mezzospada, but leaning a little bit more towards the hilt. And so we need to look into more description of measure to figure out exactly when is it that we're working. So let's take a look at Fiore's measure and go back one section, right? We go from the Stretto cross to the second master cross and see how do we describe what the measure of this location is, right? Well, if we look at the quotes, Fiore explains plays where you can cut your opponent without stepping. This gives us a pretty distinct location for ourselves to understand what the second master crossing is. But he doesn't necessarily say this. He doesn't say this is the location where you can cut without stepping. He says this is the second master cross, and here are the plays. And the plays are executed by cutting without stepping. So what kind of plays do we see in the Stretto cross to explain how far away we are from our opponent? Well, what we see is we see that you can grab your opponent's arms, and moving forward, I'll often be using arms as shorthand for anything from the very strong of their sword, right by their hilt, all the way up to their armpits. That's kind of arms, air quote. So the Stretto cross is when we can grab our opponent's arms with a passing step. So, for example, here is what we're looking at. We have the Stretto cross. We have taken one passing step. You can see that the fencer with the crown, who's on the left, takes one passing step. They move their left foot from the back to the right to the front, and they are now able to grab their opponent's arm, and in this case, pommel their opponent in the face. So this gives us a good reference point on how far away we are from when we can begin to execute the Stretto plays. So that's how we know where we can execute the Stretto plays, right? We know that we can grab their arms with a step. What about the Reverso cross? Is that the same? Is that different? What do we see? Well, we see that from the Reverso cross, you can grab your opponent's arms without a step. So, this is another example, right? We can see that our two fencers are in a position where they have come to a cross. And you can see, again, the fencer on the left with the crown doesn't move their feet, and they're able to bind the arms of their opponent without moving their feet at all, right? Their left foot forward in the first plate and left foot forward in the second one. So this is important to look at, right? Because it means that the Reverso Stretto plays have to be executed closer than the Stretto plays because of the footwork that drives the actions that are happening. So, as a side note, what we can do is we can look at the art and we can say, there's a pretty big discrepancy here in the footwork, right? We see in the art of the cross, it's like, their feet aren't even touching. But now, in this play, their feet are much closer together. Is that a problem? Does that mean that... Does the art imply that we've actually taken an additional step to get closer here? What does that actually mean? The answer is no. It's not an error. What it's showing us is that Stretto itself is a range, right? Like any measure, it is not actually one specific point, but it begins at a specific point, but can be executed from a variety of ranges, right? So if we look at the image on the left, we're looking at essentially the maximum range of Stretto, where your arm is fully extended, and with that fully extended arm, you can just barely grab the hilt of your opponent's sword. And on the right, what we can see is one of the very closest plays, or often what our club refers to as deep Stretto, which is where you're like inside somebody, you are chest to chest, you've gone full into wrestling, and you can see that their legs are all over the place. So this whole range is the area where you can execute the Stretto plays. So we've answered the next question of when do we execute Stretto? We know that the measure of Stretto is a range. We know that the beginning of that range is when we can take a passing step and put our hands on our opponent's sword. Note that by that I mean the strong of their sword, the hilt of their sword, or their arms. We know that the middle zone of that Stretto location is when we can grab the opponent without stepping. Right? This is our Reverso plays, and we know that it goes all the way to the point where we are chest to chest with our opponent and beyond. Of course, by and beyond, I actually mean when you are behind your opponent. There are plays where you actually loop all the way around to take the back. Generally, this is like a second or third intention from a wrestling play, though. So you're not generally executing it from behind. Though, as a side note, Fiore does have one play where you stab someone as they're running away from you on a horse, but that's not actually Stretto. So we've answered what is Stretto, and we've answered when do we do it. So what's next? Well, we're going to take a small aside to talk about Fiore's description of measure before we proceed. Right? So we've talked about the Dritto Stretto, how it is where you take one passing step in order to put your hands on them. We've talked about Reverso Stretto, where you can touch them without moving. So these are clearly two distinct changes in measure. But what's important is to look at the overlap between the beginning of Dritto Stretto and the end of second Master of Largo. Right? For most of you, this is not exactly the same range, but is going to have a lot of overlap. Right? The space in which you can cut someone without stepping is also the space where you can take a step and grab their hilt. So it's important to remember tactically that once you get into this gray zone, you can kind of execute either one of these lists of plays depending on the situation, depending on your skill level, depending on your opponent's skill level, right? There's all of these different factors, but we know that first Master Largo is the farthest away and that Reverso Stretto is the closest. So it's important to remember that second Master Largo and Dritto Stretto occupy the same or similar space. For those of you who are newer and don't really know what I'm talking about when I say first or second Master Largo, that's okay. We'll get more into that in the future and you'll start to feel more comfortable. But for those of you who have been doing this for a long time, may not have made this connection or understanding that in this middle zone, you can execute either one of these plays. So, let's keep moving forward. Next question. Why? Why do we use Stretto? This is another important question to ask because when learning your art, you need to not just understand what a technique is or how to execute that technique. You need to understand why you're doing it in the first place, right? What are the goals of this technique? What are the objectives that you're trying to do? Because that will teach you tactically the best way to actually utilize this. Because if you don't understand the why, then you're just going to do something and it'll work or not work, and you won't understand what you're actually doing. So let's see what we can learn about why we're supposed to do the Stretto. So, of course, like all things, we go back to the source, and we're going to ask Fiore, why exactly are we doing this? So to do that, we need to look at the quotes within the descriptions of the individual plays. Right? Oftentimes, Fiore's text is described as flowery or boastful or showboaty, which is all true. He does like to talk a lot of shit. But what's important is to recognize that within that shit talking, he's actually giving us clues or explicit instruction as to how to do these things and why we're doing those things. What do we gain by doing these techniques? So let's look at a couple of quotes directly from the various plays. Right? First, I can quickly make this move to prevent him from attacking me by taking my sword or a lock. In this fashion, I have bound you so well that you would be trapped in armor or without, and your sword will be useless against me. Another one, then I will strike multiple times until I am exhausted. Your arms have been bound in middle bind, your sword is prisoner, and it cannot help you, and with mine I can cause you lots of injuries. And the last one, I can injure you without danger. I retain your sword's hilt. I will give you cuts and thrusts with no risk. Right, so looking at only one of these quotes in isolation, you'd be like, wow, man, Fiore is just bragging a whole bunch. But actually what we could see here is consistent themes running through the description of all of these various plays, right? These themes are this idea that by constraining their sword, it prevents them from attacking me, right? It's like, your sword will be useless. Your sword is a prisoner. This is an important piece that he's telling you, that it's like, look, once you do this, you are totally safe. Like, once you execute one of these plays, they can't hurt you. This is the benefit of the Stretto play, is that you are completely safe. The other benefit is that you can hit them multiple times, and you can do it without any danger, right? I will strike you multiple times. I can cause you a lot of injuries. I will give you cuts and thrusts with no risk. Fiore is saying, like, there's once you have their sword locked out in whatever way you want to do it, they're at your mercy. You can do whatever you want. So this is the why of why we're doing the Stretto, right? Why we want to constrain my opponent, because they cannot attack me, and also, going back, they can also not constrain me, right? We look at this first quote, make this move to prevent him from attacking me by taking my sword or a lock. When executed properly, the Stretto plays not only stop you from being hurt, but also are a counter within themselves of most of the other plays. Obviously, like all wrestling, this is not a perfect approach. There are always counters to plays, but for the most part, one of the benefits of constraining your opponent is that it is more difficult for them to constrain you. So the two major whys are to constrain my opponent and to free my sword, right? And when my sword is free, I can attack you without threat, and I can attack you multiple times. So you can see in the picture here, this is the Serpentina. Our fencer here with the crown has completely constrained their opponent's sword, wrapping their arm around it. They've now freed their own sword, and you can see that this person is about to die. Our crowned fencer can thrust, he can cut, he can do whatever he wants, and there's no threat that their opponent can give them. So, looking at this, it's important to understand the benefits of constraining the sword, right? Once again, but from a different perspective and from a HEMA perspective, right? One of the things that's valuable is that when their sword is constrained, you're unlikely to double, right? They can't hit you from both a life and death situation or a fencing situation. They can't hit you if their sword is constrained. One of the other benefits, which is important within Fiore's system, is that you're not forced to cross your arms in ways that won't work in armor. Right? We know that Fiore's entire system is designed to teach relatively affluent people who are both going to be fencing in armor and out of armor. And in armor, it's either going to be at the barriers for duel or a tournament or out on the battlefield. And so what you need is a system that teaches you how to attack in ways that allow you to do so regardless of what armor you are or are not wearing. And the techniques allow you to effortlessly strike multiple times, right? So we can see in these two pictures that these are examples of areas where if the fighters were using Stretto techniques, it would look a little bit different, right? On the left-hand side, you can see one where their arms are crossed and above their head, but based on their legs, they're so close together, right? There's plenty of other plays they could be doing. On the right, you can see two fencers who look as if they're simply cutting each other. Both of them are in danger, right? Alternatively, here we can see alternatives to those previous actions. You're nice and close. You can constrain their arms, and then you can attack them as many times as you like, effortlessly. So what else? What are some other potential benefits of Stretto outside the book, right? But understanding the context of when this book was written and for the people who the book was being written for, right? One of them is to make an opponent yield in a duel or on the battlefield. This is super important based on the culture at the time, right? If you are dueling someone, you don't necessarily want to kill them if that is not part of the duel. And also on the battlefield, if you're fighting a noble, especially if you're noble yourself, you generally also don't want to kill them because either you're related or you know someone who's related to them, and they probably have a lot of money, right? We know historically people were ransoming each other all the time. So having plays where it constrains your opponent, especially on the battlefield, is very helpful because it allows you to put them in a position where they know they can't do anything, where they can yield, agree to be ransomed, and you get to go home and eventually get money. And getting money is real good, especially if you're a middling noble or a man-at-arms. Also, what it allows you to do is it allows you to subdue your friend when they do something dumb, right? This is also beneficial if you're living in a culture where people are prone to fighting when they get angry. We know that street fights were very, very common in Italy for hundreds of years. Italians have enjoyed attempting to kill each other for sport for a long time. So this puts you in a position where if one of your friends is doing something real dumb, they drank too much, they're picking a fight they shouldn't pick, you can constrain your friend in a way that allows you to stop whatever fights are going on. So that kind of answers our why are these techniques useful. So, moving on. Next question. How do we do Stretto? So, this is a big question because Fiore has a lot of Stretto within his book, both in the sword and two-hand section, and also extrapolated into all of the wrestling and all of the dagger plays, all of the armored section. Everything kind of connects. Obviously, we're not going to get into every single possible wrestling action within the book. One, because teaching wrestling remotely is not very effective. But also because over our years of training, a lot of those techniques we've found to be less effective. Not necessarily because the techniques are bad, but because of the constraints of HEMA and the situation that we're in. Some of these techniques are optimized for being in armor. Some of them are optimized for wrestling against people who are skilled wrestlers. Some for people who are unskilled wrestlers. So what we're going to present here is kind of a streamlined version of our approach to Stretto. And so this is going to be the high percentage plays that's easy to learn easy to execute actions that many of us have been able to do successfully against skilled opponents. And we're going to break it out into kind of a simple way of understanding and learning these, all using Fiore's own teachings, but and mostly within the pedagogy of his framework. So, like all things in Fiore, we're going to break it down to the Stretto and the Reverso crossing and kind of talk about what our actions are within these two positions. So, from the Stretto crossing, how do I do Stretto? Well, what we're going to do is, as you come to the cross, when you feel pressure against your blade, you're going to yield, and then you're going to strike them with the pommel. This is your opening play. Opening play from the Stretto position. What this does is, especially within the Stretto section, your pommel strike you can think of as a first intention. You are always attempting the pommel strike. From here, whether you land it or not, there are follow-up actions to be done, right? But you always want to attempt to land the pommel. The benefits of it are, if you do land the pommel, regardless of if they're wearing a helmet or not, you're going to get a free tempo or two. Having your bell rung is distracting and disorienting, regardless of your headgear. Right? For anyone who's been doing HEMA long enough and has been roughly pommeled in the face, or taken, say, a left hook to the front of their mask, will know that this will stun you even if you're wearing a good mask. And if you don't manage to land the pommel, then that's okay too. You simply move through the following plays. But this action of yielding to the pressure and then striking in with your hands is how you put your body and your opponent's body in the position to execute these techniques. So, one thing to consider within the Stretto section is that there are actually two different types of pommel strikes, which gives us a branching path of variations within the Stretto section. So the first we can see here on the far right is the two-handed pommel strike. The second variation is the one-handed pommel strike. Right? So we're going to look at both of these, the different plays that come out of them, and how you can execute them. From there, what you can do is you can find what feels more comfortable for you, whether it is one or the other, or maybe you like both, and just kind of put that into your toolbox. Eventually, I suspect that the longer you do this, the more you'll find that you either like the one hand or the two hand. For myself, whenever I throw a pommel strike, I always do it one-handed. Not to say that that is the better way, but it is just the way that I have trained more and that I find more comfortable. But I've seen plenty of people do it with the two hands, so both are certainly viable. So, we have yielded to our pressure and we have attempted to throw the pommel strike. What happens after that? Well, first we're going to look at the, this is our slide talking about the variation. We have one-handed versus two-handed, and we're going to kind of dive in. You can see that there's advantages and disadvantages of both here. With the one-handed pommel strike, you have control over their body because you've put your hand onto their arm, which constrains them, allows you to move in. It makes it a little bit safer. But by doing this, it also slows your action down. If you're doing the two-handed strike, you can flow directly from the crossing into this, and you can use both your hands to drive directly at their face. So in one case, you're gaining more control over their body. In the other, you have more speed for the strike. Notice that you're still safe when executing the two-handed pommel strike because you are past the point of their sword and they are not in a position to cut you, right? You've just yielded to their blow and their sword is moving down into your right. So it is moving away from you. So you are safe while executing this technique. So let's dig into them and kind of discuss how we execute plays following these pommel strikes. So first we're going to talk about the two-handed pommel. So from here I'm going to show you the endpoint, and then we're going to talk about how we get there, and then we'll show you the endpoint again. All right, so here what we're working towards is we drive our two-handed pommel in, and then we're going to cut our opponent. This can be is generally referred to as the pommel hook, either with the cut or with some other variations. So how do we do this? All right, we drive the pommel towards our opponent's face, and when the pommel doesn't land, we drive our hilt down towards our opponent's hands. Now, like all things in Stretto, they can be executed at a variety of ranges. So if your hands land near the strong of their sword, that's fine. What you do is you just rotate your wrists and you cut into their face with your hands over the strong of their sword. I am a huge fan of this play. I get it off all the time. It's relatively easy once you train this. It's great because your hands are rotating over their sword, and so you're constraining the strong of their sword or their hilt with your hands, and you're in a very safe position. Alternatively, if you're closer, when you drive your hands down, you press and you find that your hands are between their arms. You can press down with both of your hands, driving your pommel between their hands, and then you can either push your sword directly into their face, or you can do it like it's shown in the picture, where you remove your hand, grab your own blade, and either cut them in the throat or cut them in the face, like we see here. So that's our two-handed variation, right? Generally, we call that the pommel hook. So what about the one-handed variation? Right, so in this case, we have yielded to pressure, we have come in with the pommel strike, and we have one hand on our opponent's forearm or wrist. Well, from here, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate our opponent, and we're going to cut him in the back. So how do we get them to turn around? Well, this is one of Fiore's favorite plays. We see it all the time. What we're going to do is that after we drive our pommel at their face, when the pommel doesn't land, we place our hand on our opponent's forearm, wrist. Elbow is ideal, but you kind of just put your hand wherever you can. And then what you're going to do is you're going to push against them to rotate their body. You can see here in the picture, this is kind of the middle stage between these two plays, right? We are pushing on them against their body, rotating them. Our advantage here is, again, our opponent is already moving from right to left. We have yielded to their pressure in a Stretto crossing, so their body already wants to move in that direction. So we're just helping them move a little bit more in the same direction that they're already going. This is what's important to remember for this type of play, is that pushing against someone when they are aware of it or when they are resisting you is not very effective. But putting a little bit extra energy into someone's body when they're already moving in that direction is incredibly disorienting. And it is surprisingly easy to make someone rotate from this position when they're already going that direction. So here we can see the whole thing together. We yield to their pressure. We throw the one-handed pommel with our hand on their arm. We start to rotate them, and when they're fully rotated, we cut them in the back of the head. Now, we of course have to address this from a HEMA standpoint. We do not want you running around cutting other people in the back of the head, because that's generally frowned upon. But there's plenty of other targets here. You can cut them in the neck. You can cut them in the side of the mask. You can cut them wherever you want. Just don't brain someone directly in the back of the head, because we're not actually trying to kill people here. So that's our variation on the one-handed pommel. So within the one-handed pommel strike, we also have an additional finishing move for if you're not cutting them, right? So what you can do is, once you've put your hand on their arm, you can also throw them. You're in a very strong position to throw. So how do we do that? We drive the pommel towards their face. When the pommel doesn't land, we place our offhand on our opponent's forearm, like we discussed, and then from there, we push against their arm to rotate their body. Then we place our dominant arm across their throat and throw them. All right, so we can see here our opponent has been rotated from our push, and instead of pushing them away from us, say they've stayed really close, then what I can do is I put my arm around their throat and throw them onto their back. This is also a relatively easy throw to get off, especially if someone is disoriented. Of course, I say relatively easy. That assumes that there's not an extreme height discrepancy or size discrepancy in general. But this play flows very nicely out of the pommel strike and the elbow push. So here's the whole play, right? We throw the pommel, we rotate their body, and say they stay really close to us. We can then throw our arm over their neck, toss them to the ground. So here we are with the whole one-handed pommel Stretto section. We throw the pommel, push the elbow, and then either cut them or throw them to the ground. Right? We present it this way because now you just have a very simple flowchart of how to execute the actions. Are there any questions so far, or should I just keep rolling?
I actually had a little bit of a question, I guess. Like, I feel like I've tried to grab people around the head before like that, and I just pull their mask off, which is not a scoring action.
Got it. Yeah, so if you're pulling their mask off, generally that means what's happening is that when you're wrapping your arm across their throat, it means that you're pulling up with your arms, which is going to kind of feel natural. What you have to do instead is you have to rotate your hips for doing this throw. This is kind of it. It's likely that it just has to do with your wrestling or throwing mechanics, and especially if you're taller than the person you're doing this against, it can be very easy to pull upwards instead of rotate.
Yeah, so I think it's important to add to what Mike is saying is when you're doing the throw, your leg is the pivot point, and you're actually trying to pull them down, right, not up. So if you have your arm around them and you're pulling down, their mask shouldn't come off unless they're already falling onto the ground, right? But it's more natural to like be moving lateral, because like it's not, you don't want to just like clothesline them, right? You're trying to rotate their head into the ground, like not actually, but
right.
You're
twisting with your hips in a way that brings your right shoulder downwards instead of upwards, and
or even lateral. You don't even want to move straight, right? You're guiding them into the ground.
Right, exactly. One of the other variations you can see in this branch is the foot location, right? You can see that our lead foot is on the outside versus the inside for the cut versus the throw. It's going to be very hard to execute this throw if your leg is on the wrong side of their leg, because as Sean said, the pivot point here, not to get too deep into the actual mechanics of wrestling and throwing, but you need their leg to be collapsing because of the pressure that your leg is giving them on the back of their knee. So one of the other things that could be happening is that your foot is in the wrong place, and when you execute this throw, you don't have the correct leverage, which means that they're not falling correctly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it was actually mostly the footwork, thinking back on it, but I've also only tried it a couple of times. So
yeah.
I feel like one other thing with this is sometimes you can try to start doing the throw when you're not really set up, like where you don't have your arm in the right place yet.
Yeah, definitely. If you haven't fully like got them into the crook of your elbow or gotten your body in the right position, then yeah, if you're just trying to clothesline them with momentum, it's not going to work very well. I mean, unless you're huge and they're small, in which case, obviously, you can get away with it. But it doesn't mean you're actually doing it correctly.
Yeah, and I think if you're huge and they're small, and you try to do it while you're not set up, then their head mask pops off. So
yeah, that is also probably true.
I think also Derek brought up an important point I want to emphasize again, which is that you need to have the proper tempo measure to do the play, right? So you need to have the proper measure, have the right grips, like holding their head in the right position, and then also you need to have the tempo to do it. If they're just standing there ready for you to throw them, you're not going to throw them, right? So it's like you've, as Mike just said, you've disoriented them with a pommel or some other entry, and then you have a tempo for the throw. If you have no tempo, it's not going to work.
Right. If you look at this flowchart, if you skip number 2, if you miss your pommel and then try to immediately throw them, it doesn't work because, as Sean said, they're just standing there. You have to get either the pommel or the rotation.
Their weight to shift, yeah. They have to they need to be in the middle of doing something else for this throw to have a good chance of actually putting them on the ground.
Yeah, that's why this follows directly after the elbow push, because you rotate them, you've disoriented them, you've shifted their weight onto their left foot, which allows you to then pressure them and throw them. Anything else? That was a really good question.
Not right now, but yeah, thank you.
Cool. All right, so moving on. We've talked a lot about our variations here. So let's talk about the counter, right? Fiore tells us that all of the Stretto section contains all of these different types of actions, but also the counter to those actions. So, if the Dritto-Stretto play all derives from the pommel strike, how do we counter Dritto-Stretto? The answer is we don't let them get to Stretto in the first place. We stop it at the initial entry point. So, let's talk about the pommel strike and its counter. We see this described in the horseback section. This is a great example as to why you can't just read one section of Fiore and think you understand all of it, because he separates the plays out into various sections. So here we see him discussing how to counter the pommel and the plays that come after the pommel. As they throw the pommel strike, right, they yield to your pressure. They're coming in with the pommel. What you have to do is you raise your hand you raise your dominant hand in a way that basically deflects their pommel strike. This is seen in some of his wrestling plays and some of the dagger plays. Basically, if you're familiar with the wrestling, you're moving into boar's tooth position for wrestling. And then from there, there's a whole bunch of different actions that you can do that we'll get into a little bit. So, as I said, the pommel comes in, you raise your hand to the wrestling boar's tooth position. This is going to deflect their blow off to the side. It also critically exposes their dominant forearm. Sean, we can hear a bunch of wind from you.
Okay, let me unmute myself, sorry.
The blade wind.
Tachikaze. Alright, so they attempt the pommel. You raise your hand using your forearm to deflect the pommel to the side. And then from there, he gives us 3 responses that we can do. We can either throw our own pommel strike, right? This is great. We've been given a tempo by their missed action, and they now can't cover themselves. So we can pommel them and do our own Dritto-Stretto if we want to. We can simply throw a reverso, right? We've already charged this reverso cut by blocking them, and we're on the outside. Very easy to cut a reverso that they cannot cover. Or we can execute a disarm. So those are our 3 actions. We can see... Yeah?
When can you do the counter? How are you able to...
How are you able to do the counter? You have to do the counter in mezzotempo. When they are executing, as the moment you feel them begin to yield to your pressure, is when you have to act. You cannot act afterwards, or else you've acted too late.
Thank you.
This is important. This is very important when discussing counters, because counters to specific plays are actually very difficult to get off, because the window in which you have to act, the middle tempo, is very small. And if you execute it too early, then your opponent can see that you're doing the counter and can just do something else. And if you act too late, then the counter is not actually effective. So the counter here, we raise our hands, we have 3 plays, and they all derive from the same main action, right? We're in a good position. We can either pommel them, or we can see on the right hand, we have wrapped our wrist over their wrist, and from here we can either execute one of the disarms, or you can see we're in a very good position to simply cut our reverso. Are there any questions about this action, which is kind of weird and one we have not trained a lot? Cool. So that is all of the Stretto section. We've discussed the multiple variations. We've discussed the counter. So now we move on to Reverso Stretto. How do we do Reverso Stretto? Well, we generally call this the wrap or the ligadura mezzana. It all derives from the same major action. Once you're in the reverso crossing, you do a counterclockwise rotation with your offhand. You can see how where our arms are in this reverso crossing, right? We're in kind of, our arms are really close to each other. The moment you feel this pressure, you take your left hand, I use left assuming that you are righty, of course, off your sword. You're going to put it under the cross, and then you're just going to draw a big circle with your left hand, going counterclockwise. Now, what's great about this technique is because just like much of Fiore's actions, you get different reactions based on the measure, but they all derive from this same action, right? This is this arm rotation is the equivalent of the pommel strike from the Stretto crossing. Right? This is our entry point for all of the actions, but luckily it is also kind of the finishing point. So if we are doing this at the farthest edge of our Stretto measure, we're going to end up wrapping their sword with our arm. If we're doing this in the middle of Stretto measure, we're going to end up grabbing their wrist, like we can see in this image here. And if you are deeper into the Stretto measure, you're going to wrap all of their arms in general. So, going back, we can see the whole variation within the Reverso Stretto measure, right? On the far left, we can see that we've executed this left-hand rotation at the farthest point that we can. This allows us to wrap our arm all the way around the sword and grab their hilt. We can see a little bit closer. We do this action and we just get their wrist or their forearms. And if we're extra close, we get their elbows or their upper arms completely locked out. This is great because it means that all of these actions are derived from the exact same simple counterclockwise rotation. What we're also shown within these 3 images are the 3 different types of ways we can strike our opponent multiple times safely, right? The first, we can see we've grabbed their sword and we now have a low thrust that's open. The middle, we can see that we have a high thrust or a cut that is open. And on the far right, we can see where you can pommel your opponent until you grow tired. It's all very streamlined, very simple, and it looks like different plays until you arrange them like this and see like, oh, this is all actually just one action being shown from different measures. So, how do we counter this, right? Before we get into that, this is the whole thing. This is everything you need to know about Reverso Stretto. This is your very reliable plays, and you don't have to hold very much in your mind. All you know is that when I'm in this cross, I just let go and I wrap my arm. And then however it is that I end up wrapping their sword, whether it's their sword or their hands or their wrist or their entire arm, I just finish them off however I want. As a side note, you can see that we're getting a little bit of our original measure here, right? We have at our farthest point, we can thrust them. At our middle point, we can cut them. And at our closest point, we can hit them with the pommel. So we're seeing these consistent themes of actions we can take at different measures. So, right, Fiore gives us the action, and then he gives us the counter. So what is the counter to the wrap? Well, the counter to the wrap all begins with your own ability to react, right? Like we talked about before with the pommel, you have to act at the moment that you see the action coming in, right? You feel them take their left hand off their sword. You see them start to execute the wrap. You yourself know that you are in a Reverso crossing. And when they take their hand off their sword, there's probably only one action they're going to do, which is this big, not necessarily big, but this counterclockwise rotation. So how do you stop that? What you have to do is really quickly, you have to let go of your sword with your own offhand. This is super important because what's going to happen is it means that your offhand is no longer constrained by their offhand, right? We can see here, we kind of flip sides because, the art is not always consistent. But in the first picture, we can see the person being wrapped has both hands on their sword. And in the second picture, you can see that they've removed their hand off of the sword. So, what happens after that? Right? We double up, and then we wrench them towards the ground. Now, this is an excellent example of how Fiore shows these counters in multiple sections, because this counter is the same regardless of if you're doing sword in one hand, sword in two hands, dagger, or wrestling. So we go back here. You can see, as shown in the wrestling, our opponent has only managed to wrap one of our arms instead of two. You can imagine that these two have swords in their dominant hands. Right? You can see that the fighter on the left has only wrapped one arm. So then what do? Before they're able to strike you, before they're able to finish executing this lock, you have to double up, right? Double up is a term which means where you're taking your offhand and you're putting it onto where your dominant hand is. Here we can see he's grabbing his own wrist, but you can do this by re-grabbing your hilt, grabbing the strong of your blade, however you want to do it, and then you wrench them towards the ground. And finally, we can see that action done with the swords here on the far right. So again, this is the counter to being wrapped, but it is also important to recognize that you have a very small window in which to execute this technique. Because if your offhand gets wrapped, you can't execute this counter action. Are there any questions? All right, great. This is something that basically you will, like all counters, you just need lots of reps to get used to it, but it's also understanding the circumstances under which you have to act to be able to get it off effectively. So, that's it. We've answered how do we do Stretto, right? On the Stretto side, we throw the pommel, turn their elbow, and either throw or cut them. And on the Reverso, we wrap our arm around their arms and cut or thrust them until we grow tired. So that's most of the questions that we had about Stretto, right? We know what Stretto is, we know when to do it, we know why we're supposed to do it, and now we know how to do it. So there's kind of one more important question that we didn't bring up at the start, which is Stretto good? Right? Like, this is an interesting question to ask of our techniques that we're studying, because presumably if the author didn't think they were good, they wouldn't put them in the book. Though sometimes that's not necessarily true. There are certain authors who will put techniques in their text and then comment on whether they think they're good or not. We see this both in Luke Eckner. We see this also in Fiore, where he'll make comments on, like, I've seen people do this, but I don't really recommend it, or the percentage of times that people get this off is relatively low, right? We occasionally see commentary like that. But this concept of using constraining plays in a close measure, like, is that good? Is that a thing that is worth putting time into? Is that an aspect of a system that is effective? It's a good question. So how do we answer that question? Well, the best way we can do it is by asking, does this concept survive? And is it present in later systems? Other systems being a misleading word here. Do other authors utilize this concept, right? Because if the answer is no, then it means that either this is not good, or it is too specific to the time frame, to the weapon, to the culture, right? We are in a situation where we are not living in 1409 as men-at-arms or noblemen who are fighting as a living, right? We practice this both as a historical exploration, as a sport, and a martial art, and we need it to work within our modern context. So if something survives and is written about by other authors, then presumably they also have found it to be good, and it has continued to be good throughout history. So the question is, does this concept still survive? Well, let's look at a couple examples of other texts that have similar or identical techniques. So first we can look at Talhofer, who is writing about 60 years later. He's writing in Württemberg, which is in Germany, and Talhofer loves this play. Right? This is Fiore calls it the Ligadora Mezzana. This one specifically, where you're deep and you've wrapped your arm around both of their arms. Talhofer shows this from both sides, right? We see it here from the same camera angle. He shows it from both camera angles multiple times in his text. We see it in the one-handed sword, the two-handed sword. I believe we see it both in the one-handed sword with and without companion. It's all over his text. He absolutely loves this play, which implies, like, okay, well, it's probably good. Talhofer also, within his one-handed section, combines two of Fiore's Stretto plays, right, in a kind of unique evolution of the system, which is where he's combined the elbow push with this pommel hook. Right, we can see here that he's pushing on their elbow, but he's also hooking the pommel of his sword over the wrist of his opponent, and from here he's going to basically cut them in the back of the head. So obviously these mechanics are still very effective because he's still using them. And he's not only still using them, he's combining them in unique ways. So that's like 60 years ahead after Fiore. Let's go a little bit farther and see if his concept of constraining still continues to be present. So, what about in Fabrice? Fabrice is writing in Padua in 1601, right? So now it's a significant time jump. Fabrice is historically seen as an excellent fencer. Lots of people comment on his system, or on his texts. And here we can see almost the exact same play, but done in one hand versus with a two-handed sword, right? We can see that Fabrice has put his hand not necessarily on the wrist, but on the complex hilt of his opponent, and then he is driving an imbroccata or overhand thrust into the chest of our opponent, just like we're seeing in Fiore's play here. Next, of course, we see the pommel strike. This is one of the, as we discussed, core pieces of the Stretto crossing, and Fabrice has it right here. So, moving forward, what else do we have? Well, we have this throw, right? We can see we're in the exact same position. We have our left leg behind their right leg, our knee pressed into the back of their knee, our left hand across the throat, throwing them to the ground. In this case, Fabrice is also stabbing the opponent at the same time. Here, Fiore has not yet killed his opponent, but it's using the same mechanics and the same approach to execute this technique. Alright, so a little bit farther, L'Ange, and we're not exactly sure where he's writing, but we know that he was in Heidelberg for a while in 1664. So we've jumped another 60 years. What's happening here? Well, here we have one of Fiore's classic plays where you have grabbed their blade and then you're stomping on their knee. You can see that from the art, the position of the legs is almost identical, right? The person executing the kick is standing straight up with their leg at a downward angle right against the top of their knee. We can see that the person whose knee is getting destroyed is mostly in a straight leg position, and we can see that the person executing the technique is totally safe because they're holding the sword. There's some variation. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Oh, sorry. I had a comment, but finish what you were going to say first.
I was going to say there's some variation here where we can see that for L'Ange, he's on the outside versus Fiore is on the inside. But the core mechanics and the core idea of the technique is still there.
Mike, actually, relating to Fiore's mechanics, if you go back to the pommel strike slide again, remember we're just talking about how you do the pommel strike and then the throw. What's interesting about this picture is Fabrice is actually showing the picture after the pommel strike is landed in the middle of the throw.
Ah, yes.
So you could, so which is important to know. And so kind of like the pommel strike is setting it up, this guy's off balance, and then you're sweeping his other leg. But this is just a comment on like it's like the time is slightly different, which makes us able to see like kind of the intermediate steps, right? Because I think Andrew was asking earlier, like when, like how do you throw to work? It's like basically once your pommel strike should be sweeping.
Right. Yeah, that's a great note, especially if you look at where the leg orientation is. You can see that you've gotten the key position of after the pommel strike. The back of your knee is against, or the side of your knee is against the back of their knee, which gives you that much needed collapse of structure in order to execute the throw.
Yeah, sorry, my stream was lagging. So
No worries. I think that was a great insight there for that action. So going back to L'Ange, right? We're looking at this play. We can see it is the same knee kick. I added this note at the bottom because technically this play is found under the second master of Largo and not actually within Fiore's Stretto section, but that's okay because we already discussed that the measure of these two zones overlap each other. And just because Fiore's pedagogy places this action under the Largo section does not mean that by the definition that we've discussed today, it is not actually a Stretto play, right? We've constrained their sword, we can strike them however we like, and we're completely safe. So that's just a side note for anyone who wants to feel particularly technical about the pedagogy. Continuing on, what else does L'Ange have? Oh, well, we can see that he has this throw where our left arm is across their throat, our left leg is behind their right leg, and in this case, L'Ange has stabbed his opponent where Fiore has not yet done so. Moving on, we have Brucius.
Yeah, I think Brucius.
Brucius. He's writing in Amsterdam in 1676, so a little bit later than what we saw before. Here we can see an example of the Serpentina, right? We've executed our Reverso crossing wrap from a little bit farther away, and we can see that in both positions our sword arm is low, and we're about to gut our opponent, and there's nothing that they can do to stop us. We've also got a hilt grab on the inside, right? You can see that in Fiore, we're just grabbing the extra long hilt. In Brucius, we're grabbing either their wrist or presumably their more complex hilt. And in the same fashion, our sword is high, ready to throw an imbrocata here, downward thrust at them. We've also got this throw here where our left leg is behind their right leg, our left arm is across their throat, and we're about to throw them. Again, we see the slight variation where Brucius has already stabbed our opponent, and Fiore has not yet done so. So that's interesting, right? That this plate looks familiar. Clearly, this throw, specifically, we're seeing a lot of, right? We've seen consistent themes throughout all of these plays. And obviously, these are not all of the examples of every aspect of Fiore's Stretto that continues to appear in texts written by fencing masters. But it's interesting to see that this specific throw, done in the exact same way, continues to appear throughout history. So, the final question that we have, is Fiore's Stretto good? The answer is yes, based on the approach that we took of does it continue to exist in fencing systems? Yes. We went through some of the many examples of how it continues to permeate throughout sword fighting arts for, at least 300 years after Fiore has been executing his art.
Addendum also to what Mike just said, I just posted a YouTube video in the discussion. It's of Leonardo Machida, who's a UFC fighter. He does very similar sweeps. So as an exercise, it's a very short video. Later, on your own time, as homework, you can watch this video and see how he tests up his sweeps and trips. Exactly the same.
Yep, so we can see that that sweep, the one that we have been seen over and over again, continues to survive to this modern day, which means the answer to our question is this good? Certainly yes. So now we've answered all the questions we had for Stretto. You now understand what it is, when to do it, why to do it, how to do it, that it is good. And now you can take that and start working it into your own toolbox for training. And that's all I've got for you guys today. Are there any additional questions that anybody has on why we laid things out this way? Any confusion within the pedagogy of how we approach things? Do people find this relatively simple to understand?
It is simple and easy to understand. Also, this is really good, Mike. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I guess I did also want to make the comment that Stretto in particular has a lot of influence from a person's physical size and strength and speed, and a lot of the time you can tell whether someone will beat you in Stretto And one of the responses to someone trying to do Stretto that we didn't talk about because it is not a counter is to just leave, to get out, to flee.
Yeah.
And it is very smart sometimes to do that.
You move your sword out of the way, and then when they try to rush in, you spike them.
Correct. Right. We talked about the general counters to Stretto, right? When you're specifically in the position where Stretto has already occurred. But as Derek pointed out, if you know that you're not particularly good at wrestling, or if the person you're fencing is much larger than you, or if you just don't want to wrestle, you can not allow your opponent to enter this measure in the first place.
Well, also, once you're in this measure, I think a lot of the time you can leave if you want to.
Correct.
As long as you are nimble on your feet. Like, it's possible that you get caught and you're not in a position where you can. Like, one of the best parts about the Stretto plays is that they respond to someone's action by you getting in close while they're still trying to do that. But if you are nimble on your feet, you can get out again if you
Yep.
are ready for them to try.
And that's more of a, as Derek said, not necessarily a direct counter to Stretto, but that more gets into your own control of the measure that you want to be in when you're fencing. But that's a additional skill of learning measure, understanding your opponent's measure, and how to get in and out of it. But it is an excellent point, Derek, to understand that the ultimate counter to Stretto is to not allow them to get into measure for it, or to leave that measure as soon as the threat arises.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that I was trying to point out is that, like, there are ways that you can counter someone's Stretto action in order to mess them up real good. And then there is also the possibility that you can stop a Stretto action by not getting out of Stretto again, right?
Yep.
So, like, that's not a counter. It's a response that obviates what's happening. But, like, countering someone, I thought, I was feeling was a little bit of a difference.
Yep. Anything else from people?
I think I want to emphasize also the point that Derek brought up. When you're fencing someone, because we in Hema, everyone's a hobbyist, and there's no weight classes, right? So you need to look with your eyes and, like, conceivably see if you can wrestle this person, right? If you're 160 and this person is 240, unless you immediately do a press on their hand and strike them, you probably shouldn't be pushing. So it's like you need to, in general, you should have a game plan in your mind. Should I bring up the Stretto? Should I not? What you don't want to be doing is, like, throwing your opening cut and then crashing in like a water buffalo into them, right? So,
correct.
Like, you need to think, is this where I want to take the fight? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. Like, maybe even though you're smaller, you're more skilled, then you can hit them in this. But you need to, like, decide that, right? That should be a conscious decision, not just, oh, by sheer chance we've run into each other and now we're here, right? Like, that does happen. But, like, when you Fiore says, you need to look at how strong your opponent is. How are they young or old? What is their reach? You need to size them up before you decide whether that's the thing to do, right?
Right.
Maybe if they're like a beanpole, you want to get in and throw them to the ground. Maybe if they seem like they're very difficult to throw, then you should try to spike them with your. Looks can be deceiving, but like.
Right. You must use your inner links and be prudent about what actions you decide to take. Note that for unskilled opponents, sometimes you can simply crash in and wrestle them, but as Sean said, that is not actually the purpose of these techniques. Great. Well, if there's not any other questions or comments, that will be the conclusion of our discussion for today. Hopefully you all were able to learn the basics of how to do this, and also for the more experienced people, maybe learn some things on tactics or how all of these pieces connect with each other. And I also hope, as with all of these presentations, it's also giving you an understanding of how to interpret Fiore specifically, but also how to go about interpreting HEMA text in general, right? We're used to things in the modern day being written out with a excellent way of learning, but we don't have that advantage when we're looking at historical texts because we don't think the way that they think. And that's why we run into situations where when seen in this orientation, something looks very simple, but when it's spread across 30 different pages, it can be a lot more confusing, right? This being an excellent example where here we can see all three phases of this action, but he only ever gives us one of these three moments in the different sections of the text. So you actually have to understand the context, recognize that these three pieces are the exact same context, and that when you put them in a row, you can see the flow as if it is three different frames. And that's why you can't just read one section of an author's text. You have to look at the entire thing to fully understand what's going on. All right, thanks everybody. Hopefully we'll see you back on Monday for some more practice. Either I think likely we'll be doing another active practice where we'll be doing some drills, and then maybe we'll have some more lectures, or we've got some people with harness who might be showing off harness soon. So we'll have some cool stuff coming up for all of you.
Thank you, Mike. Great.